the alternate path now, which has been developing only over the last, I'll say with confidence, 7 or 8 seasons, is that players now frequently are scouted by U.S. junior colleges and 4-year universities of all levels, NAIA and then D3 all the way up to big D1 universities. And signing with those on a scholarship is increasingly becoming a more preferred path because it means that a player gets an education. It will still be expensive even with a scholarship. It will cost a lot of money, especially for a player from Eastern or Southeastern Europe. The cost of living is way more expensive in the US. But one has an education and one actually learns how to play the game at a level with other players who are developing rather than immediately going into a minor league system, which is much more cutthroat and less oriented around extended coaching sessions after spring training is over.
That was MrBaseball.com's Gabriel Fidler. Hello and welcome to episode 95 of the Irish Baseball Podcast. I'm your host, Rick Becker. Gabriel Fidler will be my guest on the show today. He's an expert on European baseball, and we thought he would be great at explaining the European system to all of our American listeners. If Ireland is going to end up sending a team to the World Baseball Classic or the Olympics, these processes will be important to securing a spot. Let's get started right away with diving into European baseball. Thanks for being here, Gabriel.
Thanks very much for having me on. I'm looking forward to it and excited about what you all do.
So I really want our listeners, especially the ones here in the United States, to sort of get a better sense of what baseball is like over in Europe. And we have a knowledge of how baseball, the stages go here in the U.S. You know, players play in high school, maybe they play in AAU or Legion ball, then they go to college. But the structure is so much different over in Europe. So I don't know how many of our listeners really know that. The first question I have for you is, I think most baseball fans in America know that Italy and the Netherlands have traditionally been the powerhouses in European baseball. What is baseball like in those countries? Do the players get paid? What is the level?
Well, Italy and the Netherlands are a great place to start because they have had the longest and most successful national leagues. They have for many decades now existed in what US terminology would be something along the lines of semi-pro baseball, in that not every player on the teams in the Hoofdbal Hoofdklasse, which is what the Dutch National League is called, and Serie A in Italy, most of those players are simply local players who are the standouts in their area and play for the best team, which is the one in the National League. However, several of the top teams in each league are much closer to professional, and almost every team has at least a few professionals. So the way that this usually works nowadays, though this is a little bit different than it has worked historically, is that former minor leaguers for the Netherlands, usually connected to the Kingdom of the Netherlands WBC team, though also the occasional American, Japanese, and Taiwanese player, are signed for 1-year contracts, and usually, in addition to their duties with the club, will coach the younger or second teams. This is a more common thing in Europe, where there's a first team and a second team. They're both for adults, but one plays at a higher level. A little bit like a minor league team, but very much the same club rather than a separate identity. And so this will be almost like a player coach role, except it's not coach of the same team in which the player plays. Those contracts instead sometimes come with local work, and this is more frequently in the past how it happened, where a player would come and he'd be given a job locally and would stay with a family or a baseball player or one of the coaches, or be sponsored in some way. It's increasingly becoming a little more professionalized, where the player primarily works only in baseball, but that's not always the case. For the Italian leagues, those professional players are quite frequently South Americans of Italian descent, so frequently Venezuelans, but also a few from other places. There are a handful of players from Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and then occasionally a player from somewhere in Central America. The Italians also have far more Italian Americans, whereas there are not really that many Dutch Americans that come over. So this is the process that has that is how these teams have run for roughly about the last 4 decades, maybe even going on 5 decades now in the Netherlands and in Italy.
So we've seen European teams get to the World Baseball Classic, Italy, Great Britain, the Czech Republic, a whole bunch of others. And those are the national teams in those countries. But what is the club league or like the domestic leagues in those countries?
That's an excellent question. This is one way in which there are both some distinct similarities to the US, but also some stark differences. One is simply that the best players in any European country will almost certainly play for that country's national team, just like in the USA with USA Baseball, and they'll do so via more or less the same method. If they're really superb young players, they'll play what in the US I think is more frequently called 12 and under, but in Europe we call under 12, and then progress to under 15, under 18, then maybe play for a university level team, which in Europe is called under 23, as baseball is only played at the university level in a few countries. Then there's the senior national team. And a lot of players, just like with Team USA or Team Canada, for those listening over the border, just simply make their way up the age levels. But many also enter at a higher level. U15 and U18 are pretty common levels for players to enter. So in that way, top young athletes have a very similar path. But for the rest of the players and for those who are not at that elite international prospect category, because a top European player is an international professional prospect for MLB and increasingly NPB as well as European leagues. For everyone else, it's a mixture of players who have simply played in that country for a long time, some of whom might have played for 2 or 4 years at a US university, some of whom may have had a short minor league stint, maybe Dominican or a Florida or Arizona complex league, and then came back to their country of origin, and many that simply never left, partly because of scouting regions and partly because it's really hard to live in the United States when you're from a European country, particularly a non-English speaking one. And so a huge difference in the top national leagues, even in Italy and the Netherlands, for which to answer a sub question you had earlier, the equivalent is around single A, with some players that are very much double A and triple A quality players and some that are more like rookie league players. For those leagues, it is very common to have players that play regularly, maybe not as starters, but as regular contributors from age 16 onwards. And it's frequently those players who are signed by major league organizations. For the rest, it's veterans of varying levels, and these non-professional veterans in Italy and the Netherlands are probably pro-level players at the lowest end, but are quite frequently playing from their late teens into their 40s, more or less consistently all the way through. And the national teams draw from these elite young prospects, the national league players, and then a separate category of players who have connections to the country that are more complicated to explain, but maybe would be worth my while if you feel that would be helpful.
So when we talk about these club leagues or the domestic leagues, I know we have 2 pools, right? And this is something that Americans really probably wouldn't understand, having a pool A and a pool B. Right now, where does Ireland rank in these pool A's and pool B's?
Even answering that question opens up a series of pieces of background information. But the most salient piece for the fans of this podcast is that Ireland is a team in the B level, or as it's more frequently becoming known, the European Championship qualifying tournament or qualifying round or qualifying pool. All of these terms are used interchangeably. Historically, from the time that Ireland began competing seriously as a national team in the 1980s, it was firmly a sea-level team. And you might think, oh, well, fantastic that it's moved up to B. Well, what actually happened was that the C level was folded into the B level and the A level was expanded to include more B level teams. But for Ireland in particular, more than any other team that was in the C League, this does Ireland a disfavor because Ireland was on the verge of qualifying for the B pool tournament, as it was more frequently called then, and staying there with a good chance of having some appearances at the much smaller, usually 10 to 12 team A pool. Instead, what happens is that Ireland has been bumped up to the B pool, but now is taking on the role as leaders of this emerging second tier by hosting these tournaments. So the B pool now is a mixture of some of the A pool teams, all of the B pool teams, and some of the C pool teams, all of which are much stronger than they used to be. And in fact, last year, two teams that were regularly C pool finishers in Switzerland and Hungary advanced all the way to the Euros and played extremely well. So there's a lot of hope for Ireland, even though it is now in some ways a little bit more difficult to qualify given how many more teams are at the B level, but also there are more slots theoretically available at the A pool level.
And now, is that talking about the National League teams, or is that talking about the club league teams?
That is a great point of clarification with which I should have started. And in fact, when you asked me the preceding question to start, I wasn't quite sure which direction you were headed. So everything I have just said applies to the national team rather than national leagues. And national teams are easier to explain in that there are now only two pools. There's actually not a set number of teams. There are a few countries that don't field the team at every age level every year, but there are roughly, there are 16 in the A pool nowadays, and then there are roughly a dozen to 15 in the B pool. So this is only National League teams. To carry on and answer the unstated second part of this question about national leagues, there are a wider number of national leagues for more countries, though again, not every country fields an obvious national league every year. But for the most part, virtually every country in Europe, down to the very smallest countries, Luxembourg, Malta, and places of this size, have a national league of some size and some caliber. Describing those and where Ireland fits in there is a more complicated story, and I'll toss it back to you to see how we want to investigate this.
So when we talk about these club leagues and we talk about the leagues inside these countries, are there any countries in Europe that have what we would just consider straight up professional leagues?
The closest are Italy and the Netherlands. I would add Germany, the Czech Republic, and Spain to that list. Not necessarily at quite the same caliber, though the differences are starting to get pretty small. But in terms of a straight professional league, like the equivalent of the major leagues or minor leagues, no, there is no equivalent to that, in that every player is paid, every coach is paid and works full-time for that team. But Italy and the Netherlands, the coaching staff is paid, the top players are paid, many of the players only play baseball and then supplement their income by coaching baseball, but in an unofficial capacity as trainers and youth coaches and so forth. But so if we open up the discussion to that level of play, there are these 5 countries that have very strong semi-professional circuits where each team will have 3 to 5, sometimes a few more players who are a mixture of very, very high level local players who've probably had minor league experience, possibly major league experience, and then returned home. And then a mixture of expats, primarily Americans, who are securing these contracts, occasionally Japanese players, and then less occasionally some other countries with professional experience.
So I think that gets me a lot closer to what I wanted to ask about these domestic leagues, even talking down to the level of Ireland. So these clubs in the domestic leagues, do they simply go out and try to find the best players from the US, Mexico, Japan, and other countries where baseball's more common? And are there any safeguards to make sure that these domestic leagues have players from that country competing?
That's a great question and reveals one of the differences between playing baseball in North America and playing baseball in Europe. In Europe, there are far more clubs than any American and indeed any European would ever know. It is truly remarkable to the point where I, as managing editor of MrBaseball.com, what the site that has long before my tenure covered every element, and I think I'm truly familiar with every country's system. Even I could not estimate the number of baseball clubs, but we are talking many, many hundreds. However, there are very few places where multiple clubs are in the same place and overlap in terms of the local talent pool. And travel in Europe, even with excellent public transport systems, is is more expensive because playing baseball in Europe costs more per person, uh, let's say per GDP, than it does in the US. It is a more costly endeavor, and the combined cost of travel and playing baseball means that very few players travel long distances to play baseball. And when I say long distances, I mean long distances in European terms, which is an hour or more. That would be considered a long distance. And so it's really only in a few very select areas where there are multiple clubs vying for the same level of talent. And usually what happens is these clubs have youth programs which run youth level clubs at all sorts of different age level, probably including official little league teams, official pony league teams, and official colt league teams, that the players are simply attracted to by a combination of friends or having a contact with a club or simply being closer to one club than the other. I'll give you the example of Brno in Southeast Czech Republic, one of the real hotbeds of baseball in Europe. There are three main clubs there, National League clubs. But to travel between those, even via car, is about half an hour in between. They're on totally opposite sides of the city. And although I don't know their youth systems particularly well, what happens is if you live near one or if you have contact with one, you're attracted to one. So there doesn't actually tend to be a lot of competition for them. And then when a player goes back, he frequently just signs with the team that developed him in that country. Though I will admit, ex-minor leaguers are more in demand and they do change clubs. And they do change clubs based on better contract terms, which I will say are completely undisclosed. But it's clear that players move around for this reason.
So we've seen some recent players come out of Europe and make it in the minor leagues here in America. Max Kepler from Germany is one I can think of right off the bat. Is that the goal of most of the players in these leagues?
If you had asked me this question 5 years ago, I would have said unhesitatingly, yes, this is the path to having a career in baseball. It is still very much a goal, and in signings from Germany and to a lesser extent Spain, alongside these Dutch and Italian guys. But there are also guys signing from Bulgaria and a whole host of other places. So the alternate path now, which has been developing only over the last, I'll say with confidence, 7 or 8 seasons, is that players now frequently are scouted by US junior colleges and 4-year universities of all levels, NAIA and then D3 all the way up to big D1 universities. And signing with those on a scholarship is increasingly becoming a more preferred path because it means that a player gets an education. It will still be expensive even with a scholarship. It will cost a lot of money, especially for a player from Eastern or Southeastern Europe. The cost of living is way more expensive in the US. But one has an education and one actually learns how to play the game at a level with other players who are developing, rather than immediately going into a minor league system, which is much more cutthroat and less oriented around extended coaching sessions after spring training is over. And so now what has happened in the last 7 years is an explosion of players that play in the US, at US universities, and indeed also Canadian universities. This number has gone from, and I've been tracking this ever since this change took place, has gone from about 15 or 20 European-bred players playing at US universities in 2016 to well over 200 European-born players playing in the US now in 2024. And that number, as your listeners may know, include a rapidly expanding number of Irish players, all of whom have legitimate chances to play for good universities at championship-winning levels and possibly go on to be drafted, as French Matthias Lacombe was last year out of Arizona JUCO.
That was Gabriel Fidler from MrBaseball.com. That is Mr./baseball.com. You can catch my entire conversation with Gabriel in video form if you're a dues-paying member of the Irish American Baseball Society on the Community Network website. Any one of you can head to irishbaseball.org and catch up on all 94 previous episodes of the Irish Baseball Podcast. Hear me interview players, former players, authors, podcast hosts, historians, musicians, scouts, coaches, executives, and so many more people. I'm Rick Becker, and this has been episode 95 of the Irish Baseball Podcast.